today we have one of my favorite colleague friends of all time, and a brilliant Dr. Nesser, who's been working in education for 13 years. She's an instructional, well, she actually has a lot of good news, but I'll keep the bio as it was when it was written. She's an instructional coach for Kids First LLC, a leading education support company, and is coach 5th and 8th grade science. She taught chemistry and AP Chem in both Pelham and degree in forensic chemistry, and then finally gracing us with her presence here when she received her doctoral degree in chemistry education in 2020. And thanks, sir. Sorry about that. I think we just had a large influx of people joining in. Dr. Ness, did you hear me?
I didn't. You went
I went
stagnant
away
for a second. I'm sorry.
No, I think my internet decides to act up only when I have company over. It's the worst thing. So let's try this again.
I was making sure it wasn't mine. I was a little
No, I
concerned.
think it was mine at that time. Dr. Nesser, take us away.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm pretty excited about this. It's been a little bit since I've visited my whole document, but this research was very eye-opening throughout my time as a doctoral student at USM. There were quite a few hurdles that we overcame, but in the end, I feel like we put out a great research and we had some things that we could work through. So what I wanted to get at is I was a chemistry teacher for about 11 years in the classroom. And I got students once they came to me after state testing. And if you're familiar with the accountability model in Mississippi, students are tested both in 5th, 8th grade and in biology in order for graduation. So chemistry is usually the course that follows. And by that time, students are done with testing. But we start to see some of their science deficits once they get out of that testing situation. Some things you're going to see me reference a lot are going to be critical thinking, inquiry-based learning, and then POGIL. POGIL is one of the devices that I use to help collect my data and prepare my students for what I was looking for. And they are the premise of my research, and we'll talk more about that as the presentation goes along. So as a chemistry classroom teacher, I noticed that students had a hard time grasping the abstract nature of chemistry. A lot of times students would tell me that they just didn't see it, they couldn't get it. And that really boiled down to their ability to think critically and analyze what we were looking at. If you have ever taken a state tested class or taught a state tested class, we focus on the standards and what they need to know. And sometimes those science processing skills are put on the back burner because we worry about the content and not necessarily what they need in order to put that content together. So some of the things I looked at before beginning research was what skills were necessary in order for them to be successful in science. The ACT, how could students increase their science scores on the ACT? Because traditionally the ACT science section is where students score the lowest. The ACT science test itself is based off of critical thinking and interpreting and reading data. It is not based off of what they know about the 4 major high school science sections. It's on their ability to analyze and interpret. Chemistry being one of those sections, allowed me to look at how I could use chemistry and how I was teaching chemistry to both make them more successful in the classroom as well as on their ACT science test. So this led to my research questions. I had two of them. POGLE is an inquiry-based learning system that was created by chemistry teachers in order to help students better grasp that abstract nature. So I wanted to know if using POGLE in the chemistry classroom could help my students increase their critical thinking and problem-solving skills based off of how they would do on the ACT science test, as well as looking at students who used POGLE or inquiry-based learning in the classroom versus students who had not, to see how their ACT scores were affected overall. A little bit of background to my research. So starting in the 1900s, my research brought me to the fact that chemistry teachers were taught research and development in their chemistry courses. So when it came down to student information, it was very hard to disseminate that information to students, making that abstract nature of chemistry very difficult for them to grasp. As time went on during the 1930s, we saw a huge shift in chemistry itself with the development of more of the atomic theory with the findings of the neutron, and with World War II, and I'm getting frustrated, sorry, with the development of the atomic bomb. So there was a lot of news with that, and we started to see an increase in individuals wanting to know more about the science and the process of science. In 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik, which also spurred the interest of the United States to be able to use that science education to grasp our students and bring them in. We saw that science being taught in the classroom during this time was not very effective because there wasn't a pathway, and teachers had to kind of determine what needed to be taught without any guidance. That brought on a big shift in education itself, especially science education, to come up with a process or a set of standards that teachers could use to base their teaching in the classroom. With the presentation of the 1983 Union Students at Risk by President Reagan, and through the No Child Left Behind Act, we saw that students were suffering in sciences. So state of Mississippi specifically is what I focused on, took two different routes of looking at curriculum. In 2010, they changed the science curriculum in order to address the needs by the No Child Left Behind Act, which helped to standardize what was being taught in the classroom, but it left a lot of interpretation as to how it should be taught, and it left gaps in the skills that students needed. In 2018, the state of Mississippi released a new set of standards that was based off the NGSS, or the National Science Standards. It is not directly aligned to NGSS, but it has a movement that is focused on NGSS and the SEPs. If you're not familiar with SEPs, those are your science and engineering practices, which help with the basis of critical thinking and analysis. So with that, the question came, how can we use these in the classroom to best help our students learn science as a whole? Constructivist theory tells us that students learn best through doing and using previously gleaned information and building upon that. Science itself is best learned through doing. In a school district that we had an 11-to-1 ratio of classes to lab space, it was very difficult to use a lab as our only way of students doing. So I looked for something that would help support their learning through doing, and I went through inquiry-based learning. Inquiry-based learning allows students to work through previous knowledge and build upon it through doing. The The vice that I used, as I like to call it, was POGLE. It's process-oriented guided inquiry learning. And as I said before, it was created by chemistry teachers to help students through the abstract aspect of chemistry. In biology, it's easy for students to see a cell through a microscope slide, but it's not as easy to show a student an atom and the components of building that atom. POGLE allows students to use either a model, a chart, or a graph to spark their interest in the topic that's being learned and build through that in small group learning. Each student in the group had a role so that they could guide each other through the learning. And there are checkpoints through that process in which the teacher is the facilitator and can check for understanding. POGLE was useful in the fact that students were able to work together to add to their knowledge, and misconceptions were easily caught through their checkpoints. Finally, with chemistry and the ACT, chemistry itself is not tested on the ACT, but there are chemistry-based excerpts. There is some basic chemistry knowledge that is needed, but students are not tested, on what they know about chemistry, but how they can apply the data in the chemistry situation. So POGLE supported the data by having graphs and charts and the ability to build that critical thinking. And then it was useful in helping to show students that they could read through the ACT and apply those same concepts. So my research design, it took 5 years to collect the data that was necessary to support my research in 2 tiers. So data was collected over 5 years in a 2-tier process. There were a total of 513 students over those 5 years. Each student was placed in chemistry based on their previous sciences, which most of them came straight from Biology 1. There was no pre-screening. They were just placed in classrooms based off their schedule and availability. The platform in which I collected this was a school that I had worked in for 6 years, and it's a South Central rural high school, about 28% minority, 100% economic diversity, complications, and an approximate 50-50 male to female ratio. Over these 5 years, the data started in 2019 and concluded in 2018 to 2021. So it went over the COVID year. So we'll talk about some of the complications with that shortly. In years 1 and 2, students were placed in my classroom, or the students that were placed in my classroom had the same teacher. They stayed in my class for all chemistry instruction. In order to collect the data, we had a pre-ACT science test, a post-ACT science test, and the state mandated ACT science test for their junior year. This was collected for each set of students who had come through my classroom, and most of them were either second semester sophomores or first semester juniors. Now, the pre-test, post-test, and ACT science test were all 40 questions with a 35-minute time frame. So the testing conditions were the same throughout. Years 3 through 5, there were 2 classroom populations. My classroom that continued to use the POGLE as a basis of teaching, and a co-teacher who had a different classroom who did not use POGLE as part of their teaching. Both classes gave the pre and post test, and ACT was collected for those students in February of their junior year. Now, pre-test was given at the beginning of the semester, so prior to any chemistry content. Post-test was given right before their 9 weeks test. So there was about a 4.5 month gap between pre and post test. And the ACT was about 2 months after they took their post test, just to give you a time frame of when that data was collected. Over that time period, there was changes in the classroom due to COVID. So some data, as you'll see later, has some variations, and we'll talk about how that complications could have affected what we were talking about. Okay. Research methods. My research was done quantitatively. It was all numerical test data. And like I said before, all tests were 40 questions in 35 minutes. The tests that were given pre and post test were the same each year for students. So there was a baseline. The only variability in testing was the ACT, because that was given by the ACT company, and that was the set of questions they chose to give each year. Research was analyzed in years 1 and 2 using a one-way mixed ANOVA, using the descriptive statistics. I just wanted to see if there was any difference in a student's pre, post, and ACT test scores within that one classroom. Once I looked at years 1 and 2 data, we decided to expand that to years 3 through 5, where I was able to bring in a comparative classroom to look at the differences between a inquiry-based learning classroom and a non-inquiry-based learning classroom in that testing. Initial analysis was done by a 2x3 mixed ANOVA. Once we determined what the data was there, in order to see where the major differences were and the major effects were, I conducted an independent samples t-test looking at the simple effects. Okay. So to bring all that together, research question 1 was tested in the early years using that one-way repeated measures ANOVA. What we looked at was that POGIL itself would have a positive effect on student ACT science test scores. To test my second research question, I hypothesized that when POGIL is integrated into the classroom, there's more of a positive effect on student scores versus students in a non-POGIL integrated classroom. So let's take a gander at the data. Years 1 and 2, so research question 1, I did the one-way ANOVA. If you look at the graph, the gray line was the year 2016 to 2017, and the gold line was 2017 to 2018. Students started about at a 22 or 23 on the pretest ACT score. By the time they got to the ACT, they were averaging between a 26 and a 28 overall. A little backstory, the ACT is scored up to 36 points. So the closer you are to the 36, the better you're doing. For ACT science in the state of Mississippi to be considered to be successful in a college level science course, students need to score about a 23. So their pretest were right below that comparative score of where they should be to be successful in science. In both years, we saw a significant score with a P being less than 0.001. With that, though, I wanted to look more into, was it just POGIL or inquiry-based learning that helped students, or was it through chemistry content that they got better? So that's why we brought in a comparative classroom to see what effects that POGIL and inquiry-based learning had in student ACT scores. So the first year that data was collected, the gray line is my non-POGIL classroom and the gold line is my POGIL classroom. Pre-test students started about at the same ACT score. Between the pre-test and the post-test, we start to see a split between the POGIL and non-POGIL classroom. And then when we get to the ACT science test, there's an even greater difference. If we just look at the ANOVA, we do see a significant change. But we don't really know the complete significance right here. That's why a simple effects was done on the data. So if we look at the pretest, there's not a significant difference, and that would make sense since they were both starting around the same ability level without any chemistry instruction or inquiry-based learning. Post-test, again, is at the end of the 9-week or at the end of the semester, so about 4.5 months from the start. We see a 0.002 difference. So there is a significant difference in the two classrooms at this point. The biggest significance is through the ACT science test, where you see less than a 0.001 difference. And students in the POGIL integrated classroom showed a greater increase, where students in the non-POGIL classroom actually had a dip in their ACT science scores. Something I want you to keep in mind is the difference between the time between the post test and the ACT science test was 2 months. So there could be some loss there due to them not being in a science classroom during this time. Year 2, in 2019 to 2020, this was when students were let out in March of 2020 due to COVID. So we still were able to test in February for the ACT. You can see that the students in the non-POGIL classroom versus the POGIL classroom did not start at the same place. And again, students were not pre-screened into the classrooms. They were just put in classroom based off of their schedules and availability. So this is where the students started. With the post-test, you see that there is a difference, and then the ACT, they still get further apart. Overall, it was a significant test showing less than a 0.001, but testing individually, all 3 test scores showed that there was a significant difference in student achievement between the non-POGIL and the POGIL integrated classroom. In the final year of data, the graph changed a little bit. To keep in mind, students during the fall of this school year were either in hybrid learning, where they were attending school every other day, or they were home-based learning through the internet and distance learning. POGIL was still integrated into the classroom, but with students being in and out due to being sick and being quarantined, they weren't as consistent with completing their assignments through POGIL, and teacher effect wasn't as high because they weren't there to ask the questions all the time. So we saw a little bit of a difference in the graph. The non-POGIL classroom actually started a little higher on the pre-ACT. Post-ACT, they were still a little higher, but then when you saw the difference in the ACT science test itself, the POGIL integrated classroom did rise. Again, we have a significant value, but looking at where that significance came from, the biggest effect was with that ACT science test in February. One thing that could have helped that is the fact that as we got closer and closer to Christmas and that post-test, students were more consistent in their attendance to school and being in the classroom through that time when they were taking the ACT in February. The conclusions of my data show that the first research question supports the hypothesis, and we did have a significant increase in ACT science test scores overall. The average score difference was between 2 and 8 points, depending on the student, but significantly overall, the students did show an increase in their capacity for the ACT science test. Research question 2 for years 3 through 5. The F statistics supported a positive effect for POGIL integration. And then we also saw, confirming with the independent t-test, that from the pre-test to the ACT science test, there was a significant increase of students that have received inquiry-based learning as part of their classroom experience did better on the ACT science test. So over the 5 years, we did see an increase in ACT science test scores that were higher than the pre-test scores. Some limitations to the research were sampling. Sampling being that students were not pre-screened, so some of the student dynamic was different from year to year. Students were not necessarily general ed or advanced ed. We did have students with learning support that were in the classroom, so there was a wide variety. So sampling is not necessarily a bad thing, but they were not predetermined before they came into my classroom or the non-POGIL tested classroom. Something we see a lot is student effort. students are tested out once they get out of state tested biology. So asking them to take a pre-test and a post-test on top of coursework and course testing was sometimes a deficit. They didn't really want to focus their efforts into completing the ACT test. They just didn't have the capacity for it, or just didn't feel like doing it sometimes. The method that was used could have been a limitation. I stuck with POGL because that is something that also was beneficial in helping them understand the nature of chemistry. But another method could be used to see if it gave a better effect score in the end. Teacher influence was something that came up during the reporting of my research because of having the two different teachers in classrooms. Depending on how the students interacted with the teacher, the student relationships with teachers could also influence their ability or their desire to do better. Generally, if a student likes a teacher or has a better relationship with the teacher, they're going to put forth a little more effort than someone they may or may not get along with. So looking at teacher influence could be a limitation to the results of this testing. The last thing is testing conditions. When students were in my classroom, it was 35 minutes start to finish, just like they would be for the ACT tested classroom. We followed all testing conditions. Things that we couldn't attest for is during COVID, students getting sick through that and not taking the test at the same time. But also I could not control the environment in the other testing classroom. In the future, other research that could be done, it could be done through other science courses that are tested on the ACT. So the ACT science test also has biology excerpts, physics excerpts, and earth and space science. So expanding it to look at student ability in those classrooms and teaching through there could be another way to look at this research. Changing the type of inquiry-based learning, whether it be problem-based learning or problem or project-based learning, where students work together through a single problem or through a project, or inquiry labs. So inquiry labs would just take POGL to a new level where they would actually be doing hands-on POGL versus handout based. And then data collection, we could make it more frequent. That would just increase the amount of time they are testing. And then looking at post ACT, a year, 2 years into college, how does that critical thinking and analysis follow them through with that inquiry-based learning? And now I'm going to open it up to questions.
Yeah, hello everyone. May I ask you a question?
Sure.
Ms. Shanna? Yes. So is this POGL method is a computerized method or just a paper-based method that was implemented during your research?
It was a paper-based method because students were able to just work through them as a problem set. There was no computer-based. I mean, I could send it electronically, but it wasn't completed through a computer process.
Understood. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
Would you speak more about, I guess, some of the design considerations and maybe even struggles that you had to face trying to collect data in a real world classroom?
So collecting data was a hurdle to begin with. First, you had to get approval from the district to use your students as a way to do your research, and that could be a problem for some people. My district was very welcoming in wanting to use our students because they wanted to take that information to help. Student engagement was difficult. You can't predict how a student's going to react in a situation, where they're coming from each day, what mindset they're coming to you from, what their home life is like. So data at times could be very frustrating, getting them to complete the test in the time frame, wanting to complete the test and giving their efforts. I feel like specifically with this project, COVID was a hurdle, not in the fact that COVID happened, but in the last 2 years of data collection, it affected how the data looked. Because I could not control all factors of students being in the classroom to get that instruction, it really made me worry about the outcomes of that ACT science course. Because of the consistency, it made it very difficult to focus on, very difficult to get them where I wanted them to be. I feel like students missed out on some of that POGIL interaction due to quarantines and that hybrid learning. I also feel like long-term that their scores itself could have been a little higher if we would have been in a consistent basis, but that's just a prediction based off of year 3, when we didn't have any health interruptions. So when collecting data in a classroom setting, it's not as easy as sending out, I mean, not saying it's always easy, but there's a few more problems than sending, a survey home with students where they're testing. You have to worry about their motivation. Are they being honest and true to the test? And are they giving their full efforts? And over a 5-year time frame, there's a lot of patience that goes into collecting that data, consistently and effectively over that time period.
Thank you for that answer. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes, I have a question, Dr. Buford, and but anyway, how would you balance an equation using each method? How would you do that? Say, for example, balancing an equation. Give an example of each method.
Of inquiry-based learning?
Like in chemistry, like between POGIL and constructivism.
Okay. So with POGIL itself is based off of constructivism, but with balancing equations, with constructivism, I would use their knowledge from just basic day-to-day items, knowing, okay, I'm starting with these pieces and I need to end with these pieces, and I need to make sure that there's the same number on both sides. So how would I do that? Where POGIL would take it from, say we have apples and oranges and they are going in a fruit bowl and we need to balance those out, making sure we have the same number. Then the next set of questions would deal with, if I have hydrogen and oxygen gas and water on this side, how would we balance those things? So they're showing the same method, but using common knowledge and chemistry knowledge in the same sheet. So it takes it from something basic that they understand to changing it from apples and oranges or apples and bananas to hydrogen and oxygen making water. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. So you bring in like common knowledge items.
Yes.
And then you apply that common knowledge items to chemistry items.
Yes, sir. So one of the other ones I like better than the balancing equation one is one of the POGILs we used was for the levels where electrons go in the atom. And the first example on the POGIL was a hotel. So you have different floors at the hotel, you have different rooms in the hotel, and different amount of occupants in those rooms. So it would start with, I could have 2 on the first level in one room representing the first level of the hotel. And students could see how people were placed in the levels and the order that they were placed. And there was questions that asked, what does the number mean? What does the room type mean? And how are the occupants put in the room? And then the next part of the POGIL was, okay, you have oxygen. And here is how the electrons are placed in the levels for oxygen. How does it relate to the levels of the hotel room? How are they placed based off of occupancy? So electrons were related to occupancy in a hotel, and students could see that it was a purposeful placement, not just a random placement.
Let's see. Well, that's very clever. One other question, if you don't mind.
Absolutely not.
What about team learning? Is team learning more important than POGO?
POGL is centered around team learning. Each student, generally the groups were 3 to 4 students, no more than 4. Each student had a job. So we had a student leader, we had a student researcher, a student timekeeper, and we had a student that could ask questions. So each person had a role. The leader's job was to make sure that everybody was working together. No one went ahead, no one stayed behind, so that everyone had equal input into what was going on. Our questioner was the only person that could ask me direct questions. So once they all decided they couldn't answer it, then the questioner would get me over to that group and I would answer it only after they couldn't answer it. But it was through guided questions, not a direct answer. So at first, students thought, well, if I ask Miss Nesser over here to answer the question, she's just going to give me the answer. But I would ask what they knew or what they understood, and then feed off of what they knew to guide them to the answer. So answers were never directly given, but students had to work together in order to get to the stop point. So there were strategically paced stop points that they had to check in with the teacher to make sure that they understood what was being presented in that portion. So it wasn't a start to finish, let me answer all 20 questions and turn it in. They had to check with me for their understanding. So if any misconception came through their learning, it was fixed and addressed at that point so that they didn't continue to develop on that misconception.
Well, it sounds absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
Really. And one other thing, do the brighter students tend to tutor the students that are not quite as quick at picking it up?
You know, at first it was a learning curve for my stronger students because they wanted to take the reins and just do it. But then when I started putting not as strong students in their leadership role, those stronger students started to support them in their learning, and I could watch them tutor and help them think through those questions. So peer tutoring came through it, and they started building better relationships in the classroom.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I have a 2-parter, but I'll let Dr. G go first, so I won't take up all the question time. Go ahead, Dr. G. I saw you on.
No, you can go ahead. I was going to ask her something unrelated because, as you know, I have already asked her a million questions about her work. So you can go ahead.
Well, I've been curious about this POGL since you first brought it up. And so since you're here and you're the expert, I can just ask you these questions and not Google them for myself. So great time. So question number 1. I know how well POGL works with chemistry. You've expressed that multiple times, but as you know, slight bias, I'm a biologist. So how does POGL stack up with more biology, environmental science heavy curricula? That's my first question.
Well, just so you know, POGL also expanded to create a biology and an AP biology curriculum.
Okay.
To support that learning. One thing I will say though is that it's not every activity is beneficial in the classroom, because POGL is based off of NGSS standards. So you have to be very, very strategic in which ones you do use. But there is a lot of support that can come from the biology curriculum through POGL, especially if students don't have a lot of access to those labs and hands-on.
Okay.
It's an alternate way of getting students to dig in and involve themselves thinking through those problems. One thing I like about both curricula is that both start off with basic SEPs and scientific practices. So some of the beginning POGLs deal with significant figures and how to take measurements and precision and accuracy, reading basic graphs and identifying independent and dependent variables. And then it builds into the science content.
Okay. And I guess lastly, one thing that comes up when we do this educational research is our results local? Like, I mean, you did it at your school and those results may have fit your school, but does it fit a global model? And it being generalizable research, that is always a good question, right? And so POGO has a website. POGO has researchers doing research on the effectiveness of POGO. So they know how effective POGO is. You know how effective POGO is in your area. How does what you've seen, your research, link up with I'm sure, the larger body of POGO research done by POGO?
Well,
And
the research that because I've read a lot of their research on their website as well. And they seem to align very well. One thing about POGO is it can be used in all types of school districts. It can be used in a high school setting. It can be used even in college setting, depending on the level of the activity. And as long as it's implemented correctly, it can have those results. The biggest thing that I've seen through my research and using it and their research is if it's not implemented to a T or implemented the way they suggest, then it doesn't have the same results. So if yes, it's paper-based. And unfortunately, some people implement it as a worksheet where here, take this, complete it, turn it in, but it's not designed to work that way. It's designed to be given to small groups of students for them to work together where the teacher has to be involved in that learning, but the teacher has a step back role, as I like to call it, where they're observing student interactions and helping with those misconceptions, but it cannot just be, oh, go do this independently. It has to be done in a collaborative environment for it to be effective.
All right. I like that answer. Well, Dr. G, you can go ahead and ask yours now.
Thanks. So as many of you all know, Dr. Nesser defended and walked last semester. So she is just crushing it out there as a PhD. So I have two questions. The first one is, how's life post-defense and graduation? And the second is, a lot of our grad students aren't on right now because they're full-time teachers. So if you have advice for our grad students about how to make it through, but then especially those that are doing in the same situation that you were in with family, job, all of that, kind of working it through part-time. Well,
life itself is busy. I think the title brought a little bit more than I thought it would. It's not as I've told you before, the title doesn't really bother me or I don't care if people call me that or not, but it does definitely bring a little bit more light on you as a person because people seem to have a different respect for you once you get that title and they want to ask questions. But I also feel like it's opened up the opportunity to be a better educator because I do interact with people on a different level. With my job, I work with teachers across the state, trying to help them better their classroom through whatever process, whether it's testing, classroom management, or how they're delivering their information. So I feel like through my research, it has helped me see the deficits in a better light. As a classroom teacher, it was like, oh, they're bad teachers or they don't know what they're doing. But sometimes now with my research and looking at the struggles over time, I'm able to look at a teacher and say, okay, this is where we are. What can we do where you are right now to help you in this moment? And what can we bring in to support your growth wherever we're starting? And I feel like that's made me a better instructional coach because no one fits the same peg, just like our students. I don't expect the same things out of each teacher. Even if I have 4 or 5 teachers in the same district teaching the same subject, they are all a different case, just like my students were. And as far as doctoral students, there were many times, I'll admit, that I wanted to quit, that it got a little overwhelming with everything. And it was more of self-doubt and not feeling like I was accomplishing enough, but your team around you is going to be the key to helping you get through. And I had a great committee. All aspects of my committee contributed to my final product, and they all brought something to me to help me get there, and I wouldn't have made it through without them. So your committee is super important. If you didn't have them, it's going to be a very, very difficult route. I'm thankful for the way that they pushed me to get to where I needed to be. And when I first met some of my committee, I was unsure that I would finish the program, but they helped me see where I needed help. And not only did they address where my needs, but they helped me get through those needs to produce this research and be able to finally walk in the fall. Did that answer? Any other
One
questions?
thing I was going to mention, I recently met with one of your committee members, Dr. Hugh Broom, and he said that he has been getting lots of calls lately for chemistry specific CEU professional development opportunities.
Really?
And then he was like, this Shanna Nesser person who is doing this research, maybe she would be interested. And so you might reach out or talk to him or check in, because he is looking for somebody actually to brainstorm possibilities with too. I know we have another chemistry teacher. I'm not sure if you know her, Shauna, on the coast, Tanya Tellier Brooks. She's in our PhD program right now. So I was thinking about mentioning something to her too, but it could be pretty cool. I don't know if you're already doing this as like POGL, PD or anything.
I have
like
not. I have
chemistry.
not.
But there's
That is
a
a good thought.
This would be a good way to jump off.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that, and I will definitely reach out to him.
I'm happy you mentioned that. The power of a good committee is a very amazing thing to have. And I do have to say, not because they're here, but the committee chairs, they run their doctoral department, they run a tight ship over and around those parts. I don't know what they're doing. I'm not in meetings with them 3 times a week, but they run a tight ship. That's what can I say. And Dr. Nesser, if you had told me you was having imposter syndrome, I would have told you what Dr. Julie Swickle tells me. You're amazing, and cut that out.
Well, and I don't think it's a bad thing. It just that sometimes when you don't feel like things are going as quickly as you would like them to, you start to wonder, well, did I not do something I wasn't supposed to, did I fail on this part? And so, I think we all go through that, and that's something normal.
Yes, failure to my grad students is going to listen to this video. So an important part of the research process, if you hadn't failed at least twice and maybe cried a time or two, that you really look at the data, because it's never clean. That's why I asked you those questions about those problems you ever collecting. And even if it's cleanly collected, it's hardly ever processed properly. There's always the assumption that just wants to go wonky. Something always happens in research. And that's why it's important to have that team both inside and outside of the department to just keep you going.
It's super important.
And those check-in meetings there, I've learned pretty big too. So does anyone else have any other questions? Let me make sure I didn't miss anything in the chat. I always forget chat. I'm sorry, chat. No, not this time. Well, Dr. Nesser is one of our own. If you have any questions for her, you can either email her directly, email me, and then I'll email her directly. I think those are the only 2 options, actually. So those are the two ways to get your questions across. I don't know why I thought that was the 3rd one, Dr. Nesser. And thank you for coming out and giving that wonderful talk. It was better the 2nd time. You've really grown into that research. I feel like it's yours now, and that's great.
Well, we didn't have a squirrel disrupting it this time.
Those
The power
don't
outage
squirrels.
is perfect.
Can you just please, because the grad students are going to be watching this, you have to tell people what happened in your defense and how you rolled with it, because it was notable.
So the day I defended, I think I had gotten halfway through my lit review, and the power just went out. Everything went out except the emergency lights. We tried everything to connect. We were using everyone's hotspots. We were trying to, dial up, I don't know, carrier pigeon, anything to try to get the PowerPoints back up and streaming, because I had in-person and Zoom links for my dissertation. I think we were down about 45 minutes before the emergency generators kicked in the building we were at. And we finished out, and later I found out that a squirrel had sacrificed himself to stop my dissertation presentation.
I actually didn't hear that it was a squirrel, so that makes it even better. And just so y'all know, she did not even cry during that, and I 100% probably would have. And so statistics 100% probably would have. Anyhow, so yeah, if she can do it, y'all can do it without crying.
It's always a story to tell.
I forgot about that squirrel. That is a great story. I have to remind people that because you persisted. I'm like, it felt like a bad time. You thought maybe it's time to just hang it up. And we all get that feeling that you're like, I should retire today. It's been a bad week at work. It's time to draw some unemployment.
I remember it was the climax. You were about to go into your results, and
I
like,
was getting
"What's
excited."
happening?
Because how
It's
can
like
you
a roller
even
coaster that you're getting up to the top
Yeah.
and then it just stops.
and then you're stuck, yeah. Because how can you describe your stats without showing any data or figures or anything? It would have been
Well, I mean,
mystical.
I would have resorted to a whiteboard and a dry erase marker if I would have had to. It wouldn't have looked as pretty, but we would have figured it out.
All right. I'm having fun, guys. Well, does anyone else have any questions? All right. Well, this is further proof we need a podcast. And more importantly, this concludes the final speaker series session. I think that's how it's worded of the semester. I've had a great time. Thanks for coming, everyone. And remember,
Bye, guys.
email one of us with your questions.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.